Hi BookTube, welcome to a Sideline video. Today we're going to look at two books. I'm only going to count one of them for my Read What You Own challenge because I read one of them previous to my challenge and one during. The first book we're going to look at is Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach, and that was published in 1971. And then we're also going to look at Who Moved My Cheese, written by Dr. Spencer Johnson. That came out in 1998. Now, I reread both of these books, as I said recently, but I first read them at the time they were published. And the reason I read them is because they were such a cultural phenomenon in their time. And what I mean by that is that in addition to being read by the kind of people who read books in their spare time, these books were also bought and read and discussed by non-readers. I can remember when Dr. Spencer Johnson's book came out in 1998, I was working for a very large electronics wholesaler, a company employing about 500 people at its head office. So, of course, it had an on-site restaurant to cater for lunch for all these people. And I can recall conversations at those lunch tables in 1998. People who never talked about books were suddenly talking about Who Moved My Cheese. Now, these books might seem completely unlike one another at first glance, but they are, in fact, both examples of a genre. They're examples of parable literature. Parables are fictional stories that are constructed to make a spiritual or moral point. Practicing Christians are going to be very familiar with the word because there are a number of parables in the Gospels attributed to Jesus. And I think the appeal of Jonathan Livingston Seagull and Who Moved My Cheese can probably be explained, at least in the West, by this cultural familiarity with parables. Even so, isn't it interesting that simple stories trying to make a spiritual point could have such a broad impact during a time in the West when religion, established religion, was having a declining impact? I'd like to consider that. I'm going to summarize the contents of both books and then consider the pros and cons of taking your guidance from parable literature. We'll start with Spencer Johnson's book, Who Moved My Cheese. This parable has readers consider reality as a kind of maze through which two mice and two very small humans go out daily in search of cheese. Cheese is defined as anything we desire. All four characters find the same source of cheese, but they don't react in the same way to that discovery. The miniature humans, they develop a complacent assumption of security, and that complacency makes them less prepared for change on the day that the cheese runs out. The moral of the story is that the best reaction to change is immediate acceptance, or better yet, anticipation of the change, and then some forward-looking action to find what you desire somewhere else. If we look at Jonathan Livingston Seagull, what we have here is a main character, a seagull named Jonathan, who does not conform to type. His fellow gulls, including his parents, invest their energy in survival, in hunting for food, in mating, nesting, bringing up young. Jonathan invests his energy practicing flying maneuvers, which do not improve his chances of survival. In fact, Jonathan is so absorbed in this strange practice that he often forgets to eat, something that's very dangerous for a wild animal. Jonathan's efforts, they take him to a higher state of existence, one where he no longer needs to worry about physical survival. He's beyond, it seems, even the confines of time and space. To get the moral of this story, maybe what I'll do is use Who Moved My Cheese parlance. I think if you were to try to give a moral to Jonathan Livingston Seagull, you might say that Jonathan somehow finds a way to live outside the maze. You could retitle Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and maybe you could call it You Don't Need Cheese, or There Is Something Better Than Cheese. So what lessons could be distilled from this peculiar little book about a seagull? It does question our preoccupation with conformity, cultural conformity, the maze, if you like. In this case, the gulls who fly in search of food are just conforming, just like the mice scurrying around in the maze in search of cheese. And in the reality of Jonathan Livingston Seagull, characters like Sniff and Scurry and Hem and Haw from Who Moved My Cheese, they'd just all be lumped together as those unimaginative, conforming beings who are unable to conceive of any life outside the maze. So this book is championing unconventional, maverick, creative thinking. And there are individuals whose focus and determination on the strangest things eventually draws others to them, and they can be the beginnings of a cultural change. Now, the drawback is that Jonathan Livingston Seagull is not a parable that everyone, or even people in great numbers, can apply to real life. You can take some encouragement from it, that it's sometimes good to take risks. It's sometimes good to have faith, even when you're doing something that no one else is doing, that has never done before, that laughs at you, conventional people laugh at you for doing. But the lofty supernatural level of idealism that's in this parable, it really gets hard to take it and figure out a way to use it in real life. It's true that mavericks, they sometimes hit on a winning concept and they do achieve success. And like Jonathan, they may even achieve a kind of immortality, but only in the sense that people will remember or use their accomplishment for some time after they are dead. But mavericks don't always get rewarded for their new direction while they are alive. That's the unfortunate truth. So whereas Jonathan Livingston Seagull allows Jonathan to be immortal, he becomes a resurrected Messiah. He gets to enjoy the adulation of his followers. It's not real life. It's not real life. And Jonathan Livingston Seagull, by putting this emphasis on the unconventional individual, is sort of neglecting to say that not everyone wants to be unconventional. In fact, unconventional people are very often subsidized by a larger body of conventional ones. The Jonathan Livingston Seagull parable, it makes it seem as though Jonathan miraculously survives without eating. But the truth for most people who strike out and want to do something unusual or creative is that really they often have to give up some of their energy to get a paid job to subsidize what they do, or some other kind person or kind people have to give up some of their resources to support this creative maverick person. So I find that Jonathan Livingston Seagull it's a little idealistic. It tends to lean into the same kind of views that Ayn Rand expressed in her novel The Fountainhead, where architect Howard Rourke, you'll remember, he battles because he wants to get free from working for others so he can be liberated to produce his own designs. Both books put this great emphasis on the individual who has that initial idea, that new thing. He wants to spearhead a new movement. And then they minimize the role of those very necessary people who have to follow the movement and support it to keep it going. In fact, they are the movement. The movement is never the spearhead idea. That's not a movement. That's just an idea. The movement is not a movement until a lot of other very conventional people get involved. A lot of other very conventional people stay committed. So let's switch over now to Who Moved My Cheese and consider what are the beneficial lessons that can be taken from the book. Who Moved My Cheese is correct in diagnosing how much change disorients and disturbs us. And the emotions that happen as a result, they're debilitating, depending on what kind of change it is. Those emotions actually make decision-making very difficult. And if the Who Moved My Cheese story is anything, it is short, simple, quick to read, so that even if you're in a rather bad place, you may be able at least to read it, and you may or may not be able to act on its ideas right away, but you may be able to sit with it for a while and let your brain consider them, and there may come a point where you can see how some of those ideas could be a roadmap for your own process of adjustment. It always allows for hope, this little book. The character of Hem, there's always a character that's meant to represent the worst example. Hem represents the person who's so deeply attached to an old idea, old behaviors, old realities, that they enter a kind of paralysis when change happens. And the book always remains hopeful for Hem, that even though it might take time, even though that paralysis might last a long time, the person who's the most debilitated can nevertheless benefit as soon as they reach a point where they can adjust. But I do have some misgivings about Who Moved My Cheese. I feel the story champions almost emotionless response. Sniff and Scurry, the two mice, they're presented as the most efficient characters because they have no emotional needs, it seems. They just adapt instantly to change. Hem and Haw, they have all the feelings, and okay, it's not condemned, but it's certainly portrayed over and over as highly inefficient. The parable is just a simple story. It can't explore the difference between destructive and needful emotion. But if cheese is connected with desire, well, desire is an emotion. So there's going to need to be an emotional journey if you are shifting your desire from one place to another. Now, you can argue, well, reality doesn't give us the luxury of time for all these emotional journeys, but some things you can't cheat, some things you can't take a shortcut on. If you fail to process emotions before you take action, you can head off in an incorrect direction. You can actually go in the opposite direction of cheese, the opposite direction of what you actually desire. And suppressed emotions do not go away. They just find new ways to disturb your efficiency sometime later. So I guess I would say, in summary, it's probably not good to have this as the only book or the only source of help if you are going through or have experienced a traumatic change. So what do these two stories have in common, if anything, and how do they differ? Well, Jonathan Livingston Seagull and Who Moved My Cheese, they are overall about adjusting our outlook, changing the way we regard reality, which is the first step to making some changes to reality. Jonathan Livingston Seagull tends to have a downer on simplistic, animal-like behavior, if you want. The kind of thing that Sniff and Scurry, the mice in Who Moved My Cheese, are good at. What it encourages is subversive, counterintuitive, almost transcendent thinking, and that sometimes means persisting with a personal conviction in the face of opposition or hardship. Now, if you think about it, that's very different than Who Moved My Cheese. You know, Haw, one of the characters in Who Moved My Cheese, he does learn to visualize. He does do some transcendent thinking. He visualizes the achievement of his desire, which the book credits with helping him to keep going in the face of hardship. However, Who Moved My Cheese, it really suggests that you shouldn't be doing opposition. You shouldn't be holding on to a conviction rather than moving on. So in that way, it's advocating almost a different kind of thinking. So if you've got one book saying one thing and one book saying something slightly different, what do you even do with these books? Is there any usefulness to either of them? So what I decided to end with is just some thoughts that I have on how to read parable literature to get the best from it. And the first tip is, in spite of the euphoria, because these little stories, because they're short and simple and they usually have very happy endings, it's easy to get carried away with them. But before you let the euphoria do that, put the book down, sit for days, and just think. Think of the questions the parable is not asking, or it's asking, but it doesn't answer. Let's look at Who Moved My Cheese. Who Moved My Cheese never addresses the title question. Who does all this cheese moving? And what is their motivation? Okay? Think. Stealing is cheese moving. Murder is cheese moving. In the UK here, we recently had a situation where a number of UK post office managers were accused of theft incorrectly because of a software error. That is cheese moving. Similarly, the death of Stephen Lawrence, the death of George Floyd, the death of many, many others is cheese moving. Now, these are just a few examples where Who Moved My Cheese would not be the best guide, because Who Moved My Cheese would say, well, if your cheese moves, just carry on. Don't stay put. Don't fight. Don't demand that you have some compensation or that you're entitled to anything because of the loss of that cheese. That's what Who Moved My Cheese says. That's not always helpful. My second thought is that it's okay with parables to be a bit of a picky eater, if you will. That is, you just come and you take one or even two concepts, little ideas out that seem helpful, and it's perfectly fine to leave the rest. If I could stretch a metaphor, and this really will be stretching it, okay? If we think of a parable as being better if it's used as a towel. You know, a towel is something that you just need in a particular situation for a very brief time. A parable, it's better not being worn like clothing, you know, something that covers you all day, every day, and it always decides how you can move. It's okay to reject parts of a parable as untrue or at very least unrealistic, unapplicable to the situation at hand. And it's also okay, I think, to come back and look at the parable after many years, many months, see if anything is new, if anything strikes you differently, because your circumstances are different. So to sum up, what would I say? I say parable literature it's fine, it's something to explore, but I'm always going to beware of any literature that encourages me to stop thinking. There's a quote on page 71 from Who Moved My Cheese, which always, made me sort of step back a little bit. It's talking about Haw, one of the human characters, and it says, he knew he had learned something useful about moving on from his mice friends, Sniff and Scurry. They kept life simple. They didn't overanalyze or overcomplicate things. See, it's fortunate, I suppose, or unfortunate that I've had experience with religious cults that teach that same kind of don't overthink things, don't overanalyze. Truth is simple. No, keep thinking, keep analyzing. Also have and take the journey with your emotions. It has to be done. It has to be done. So Who Moved My Cheese is fine, it's great, but it could easily be misused by someone as a tool for achieving unquestioned cooperation. It's not that there's anything wrong with the book per se, it's just that there could be something wrong with the way you choose to apply the principles. So I say, keep on thinking. So that's my little sideline. And it's the end of May. It's the end of May. I can hardly believe it. I'm crossing my fingers and saying, I hope everybody out there has managed to meet their reading goals for the month. Okay. But if you didn't, never mind. Another month is coming. You just keep going, right? Everybody, I'll look forward to seeing you again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.